Do the right thing. People that you're leading expect you to do the right thing. If you can't do the right thing with yourself when nobody's around, then how on earth are you going to ever consistently do the right thing, especially when the stakes are high, when the pressure is on, when you're going to be most likely to succumb to your personal shortcomings? So it's this idea of really being able to control yourself, to lead yourself before you ever start thinking about leading other people. Welcome to the Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. JT, something I think we really need to talk about today is this idea of character. You know, in the work that I've been doing, character is one of the 4 C's of leadership. You know, character, competence, caring, and communication. You got to have all 4 of those, but character is the bedrock of it. And I think what better thing to talk about today maybe than this idea of character and the role it plays in exceptional leadership.
I agree. When we were doing episode 2 and sort of first touched on the 4 C's and really delving into what leadership is in very broad terms, the idea of character really caught me. As a father of 3, what is character? What does it look like? What does it look like in ourselves and in others comes up all the time. Mm-hmm. So I guess my question for you in trying to really get down to the nuts and bolts of it is, what is character?
That's a seemingly a simple question. It's really fairly complex, as I've studied it and read extensively on this idea of character. And I think that character is, if we want to make it really simple, probably we could say it's who you are, how you manifest to yourself and the world. It's this idea of presentation, whether that's how you interact with other people or how you really kind of interact with yourself. And that's something we don't think about a lot, I think, as it comes to character. But it's fascinating when you start drilling down on character. There's a duality to character. There is the self component and there is the others component. And the self component is comprised of certain virtues, like being honest with yourself, but there's a others component, being honest with others, right? There is integrity. What you think, say, and do all are in alignment. So there are a lot of different virtues that are related to self that make up our character and how we function. But then there are a lot of virtues, compassion, this honesty with others, helpfulness, so forth, that go into the idea of character as well. So there's this dual nature to it, where we're really talking about how we behave with regard to the orientation to ourselves, and then how we behave with regard to orientation to others.
I think that's interesting that, I would say I don't think about that much. I think when my kids ask me, and usually it's in me scolding them about some way that they act or interacted with others, when I'm talking about character, things that come up are like, it's who you are in the dark, it's who you are when no one's looking, things like that. Mm-hmm. But a lot of it is sort of put forth as these are interactions that go out from you to others, some interaction, but you're really talking about one part where it's how you interact with yourself. Can you expand on that a little more? Because that I find is the most interesting, because I think you're right. I mean, when I'm thinking about it, it really is. I mean, that's sort of where it starts, but I would say, when I'm talking about it, I usually don't talk about much of that. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of character as it relates to how you are with yourself and how you interact with yourself and not how much you interact with others?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that when we think about character, again, it is often we're reflecting on observing other people's character, what we
Mm,
assess to be their character, or what we're manifesting to other people. But ultimately, especially for leadership or parenting, this idea of character wherein if you can't lead yourself, you're not going to be a good leader of other people. That's a fundamental principle. You have to be able to lead yourself. And that's why people have written about this, spoken about this. Admiral Bill McRaven, who was a Navy SEAL, he gave this great talk, commencement address at the University of Texas at Austin several years ago, and it's a famous commencement that's on YouTube, and we can link that in our show notes and so forth. But one of his key ideas was make your bed. Have something that
mm,
you do every day that is dependable and is an accomplishment. But it's this idea of being able to know yourself and being able to have the self-discipline, which is another component, another virtue that comes out when we talk about character, but to be able to do the right thing. And that was something that has come up over and over in my work and in the interviews that I've had with four-star generals and admirals. Do the right thing. People that you're leading expect you to do the right thing. And if you can't do the right thing with yourself when nobody's around, then how on earth are you going to ever consistently do the right thing, especially when the stakes are high, when the pressure is on, when you're going to be most likely to succumb to your personal shortcomings? So it's this idea of really being able to control yourself, to lead yourself before you ever start thinking about leading other people. We have a lot of people in society that have that totally off target. But it really gets to one of my favorite precepts, know thyself. And know thyself is a really ancient concept. The oracle at Delphi. So in ancient Greece, Delphi was the center of wisdom, if you will. And people would go. And so on the wall at Delphi was written in Greek, know thyself. That was the central tenet. And if you read Sun Tzu, The Art of War, which is one of my favorite books, and we'll put that in the show notes where you can find that. But one of the principal ideas in that, the concepts in that, is Jertsi Jerpi by Jambudai, which is Mandarin for know thy enemy, know thyself, and you should not fear the outcome in 100 battles. And the key there is knowing thyself. What are your weaknesses? Where do you fall short?
mm,
Where are you going to have problems? When you know those, you can work on those. You can build on those. You can mitigate against those. And when you know your opponent, then you can take advantage of their weaknesses. And so,
So, when it sounds like they can't have one without the other. I mean, like, it's not like you can be a
well, that's
great leader,
integrity, right?
have,
Like yeah,
yeah.
exactly. That's this idea of integrity, which is integrity and the root word, integer in math. Is one. It's non-divisible in a sense, right? It's not
Mm,
doesn't have a decimal and so forth. So an integer coming from the same root, integrity, it's unified. So the way you think, speak, and act are all consistent.
mm.
And that consistency is really, really an important thing when it comes to leading and people wanting to or acquiescing to follow.
Where do you think most people tend to get the character of self wrong? Is it that they don't know themselves, or that they know themselves and choose to ignore them? I guess is it sort of like ignorance, or is it I know what my shortcomings are, but I'm going to ignore them?
Well, what do you do? Like for you?
It's a great question. I would say I underestimate my shortcomings. Like, I routinely know what they are. I know that, listen, when I'm tired and I'm post call at work, I know one of my weaknesses when I'm tired is to jump to anger.
Sure.
And that is not a person of character who, when I interact with my children, is going to jump to anger. But I know that but then I still do it. Like, and at the end of the conversation, and I'm apologizing to my children for responding in a way that's not appropriate, I realize, like, that's a shortcoming of my character. I know that when I'm tired, I'm going to not have control of my emotions and respond in a negative way.
Yeah.
So for me personally, I would say it's really a combination of the two. Like, I routinely think it's not as big of a deal, and it's not, oh, I'm weak in this area, but it's not that weak. And, it ends up every time it rears its ugly head in a fault of my character, I realize, oh yeah, it's actually a much bigger deal than what I think.
So you hit on something that's really valuable to think about, is how do we behave under pressure, under stress, so forth. Anybody can play nicely. Well, I might be overestimating some people, but we'll say
present company excluded.
Most people can play nicely in a given circumstance. But when the pressure is on, when you are squeezed, what comes out? Lemon juice or lemonade. And so I think we all have some threshold where probably it's not as much lemonade as we would like, right? And so there's this idea in the first chapter of the book on character that talks about character being a spectrum. Nobody is infallible. Nobody is perfect. If any of the listeners out there are, you're listening to the wrong podcast, I imagine. Probably in the wrong business in general. And so, no, I've yet to meet a perfect human, and so as a result, we all fall short at some point. That's the nature of humanity. We make mistakes. Hopefully, we learn from them and improve. But character, as I think about it, is on this spectrum, and it depends on the certain virtues. Patience is a virtue, right? And that's a part of character. And there are some people, you can imagine kindergarten teachers, have patience that it's just almost irrational to me how patient some folks are. I love them for it, but it's profound, right? And so maybe they've got a 10 on patience, but if we said, hey, we need you to go into this burning building or jump out of this airplane, demonstrate courage to rescue or whatever, maybe they wouldn't be able to do that. Maybe they'd be somewhere on a 2 or something. I don't know. I'm sure there are plenty of kindergarten teachers who would rush into burning buildings, but point being, we all have different levels of these different virtues. None of them probably are at the peak, and certainly they vary across domains. So there's this idea that everybody's different with regard to their character, in that if we thought about virtues as, you can have a 10 on this one, and a 5 on that one, and a 2 here, and a 7 there, or whatever. And ultimately, I think when we think about people, when we talk about someone of character, it's someone of high moral character. We're really attributing something positive to that person, as opposed to saying they have poor character, they have low character, no character, whatever it may be. Most of the time we say a person of character, we're talking about those people who are, for the most part, high, above the 5, more toward the 10 on any of these given metrics. So I appreciate that you bring up this idea of when we're stressed, when we're low on energy, when we've been up all night dealing with kids who are sick and dying, and you've got to make these immediate decisions that are life and death or what have you. Your tank is empty. And so, but knowing that, right, that's one of the keys, is to know yourself, to know that, and you hit it on the head, that is a place where you have difficulty in that setting. And so trying to put together a system to mitigate against that. I think that's fundamentally what we all have to do. If we're going to lead well, we have to, again, it gets to know ourselves. We have to get back to, okay, where do I mess up? But you ask the question, is it ignorance or is it dishonesty? I would say, I guess it depends, maybe. Certainly, I think some people are dishonest in a sense, not because they're trying to be, but because we all have these biases, right? These psychological biases. Mm-hmm. And there's one that my kids, all the time, I've told them this so many times about what's called the fundamental attribution error, that it's a joke around our house. Oh yeah, Dad, the fundamental attribution error. But the fundamental attribution error is basically this. I know all of the background and context and the information, the data that I have in my life experience up to the moment that an event happens. I don't know your background and context and life experience and everything that leads up to the same moment. So I can only look at all the data that I have and look at how you behave and attribute to you a reason for that behavior. So the example that I use usually is, let's say that we're walking in opposite directions in a corridor. Now let's say you're coming from somewhere in the hospital and you've gotten a call, hey, this kid is crashing and we're going to need to go on ECMO and you know, it's breaking loose, and you have to get to the ICU as fast as possible. So you're going, right? And I'm having a great day and I don't have a lot to do at that moment, and I'm walking along and I'm like, oh, here comes Justin. Hey, Justin, how are you? And you zip right on by and pay me no attention. From your perspective, hey, Justin, how are you, is a stupid question because a child is about to die. You don't have time for niceties and so forth. You've got to get to the ICU. So Tom's an idiot. Why would he be worrying about that sort of thing when I've got something to do? So you attribute to me that I'm just clueless or don't have enough to do. And I see you and I think, well, that guy's a jerk. He didn't even say hello. I thought we were friends, right? So I attribute to you that you're a jerk because I don't know the story, right? And so the fundamental attribution error is we use our data that we have to make us look good and the other person look bad if there's discrepancy in the signal. And so
that really keys in on a lot of other stuff that we'll eventually talk about, communication and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You know, as we're sitting here and we're talking about character, I think about every leader I've had in my life that I would say is a great leader. And it's shocking now, sort of looking back, that even when they're giving me tasks I don't want, they're organizing a system that I don't like, ones that I always say are great leaders are ones that had integrity, that everyone would say, yeah, I don't like what they're doing, but they always use a different term, fair, they're honest.
Sure.
You know what you're getting with that person. It's interesting, and it's so much of the leadership, what they're delivering matters if you're like, okay, I'm going to accept this because I know this person is a person of integrity. I know they're being honest. I know they're being fair. I
Right.
know like they're not going to tell me one thing and then they're going to tell someone else a different thing and mean that. So as you're talking about character in it being a spectrum, obviously we need to first identify where we are on that spectrum, like you said. Like what am I good at? What am I bad at? But when you look at that, do
Where do I
you
have
focus on
areas where I could
strengthening?
grow? Let's say that, not
Yeah,
say
do you
bad.
focus on strengths? Some people would say, well, in sports, like the gymnast, like that only does the pommel horse. He's winning a gold medal because he focused on his strength. Is that something we do in character to try to emphasize the things we know we're good at, or do we identify our weaknesses and work on those, or is it sort of a combination? How do we move from a 2 to a 10 overall on our character?
Yeah. So let's. So you had a couple ideas there, and well, I'll talk about the last one first, then we'll come back to the first one, which
We
was
have to draw our readers a map.
this idea of honesty. You were talking about honesty and integrity and those sorts of things. So I want to get to that because that's really important. Um, but to your question, do we play to our strengths when it comes to character and ignore our weaknesses, or do we try to buttress our weaknesses? There's a lot in the literature on playing to your strengths when it comes to leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Those actually primarily are not speaking about character. Those books and papers and so forth are really talking about, hey, if you're a visionary, be a visionary. If you're a coach, be a coach. If you're a democratic leader, be a democratic leader. Play to your strengths as it pertains to some of your leadership styles and things. Maybe build up some of the other things, but really play to those strengths. When it comes to character's actually not like that. Because when you can have a fatal character flaw. I may be the most courageous, most loyal, the most self-disciplined, rattle off 20 different virtues. But if I'm dishonest, nobody cares about the rest of that.
That's true.
If I'm not reliable, if I'm inconsistent, I mean, if you want to be a terrible parent, right? Be inconsistent with your discipline. Studies have shown.
Am I going to be in trouble for this, or are they going to let this go?
Right, exactly. Nobody knows how to respond if you're inconsistent. And so they don't know what to do, so they freeze. And as a result, they don't accomplish what the goal is, and then everything sort of falls apart. If you consistently lie, only people that are benefiting from that lie will follow you. Eventually, they will recognize one of two things, and this is a principle that's in this book here, and some other things I'll mention here momentarily. But this is a really good book, Everyday People, Extraordinary Leadership by Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner. Barry and I have worked together on some research and published a paper I mentioned in a different episode just lately. And we can link that below, and also the book, we'll link that. But so the thing is, when we're dealing with people who are lying, the two things that will come out, A, those people will follow you only up until you begin to lie about them, and then they will desert you. Or at some point, they recognize that because they're following someone who is dishonest and lies and cheats the system or what have you, that they have given up something of themselves, something of their own character. And then that they have to wrestle with that and deal with that, and eventually that will erode the leadership. So there are these two facets to that, but ultimately they end with failure of leadership because people will eventually not be following you. So that's a component of this thing when we talk about character. There again, and you can pick random virtues. Let's say courage. If you are 1 on courage, total coward, probably going to have a hard time getting people to follow you, because cowardice manifests in not standing up for your people. You have to back your people. When you ask somebody to do something and they do it in good faith and it fails, that's on you to take responsibility. When you don't, then that totally erodes your standing and your ability to lead. But we see that all the time. And so I think as it pertains to character and as it pertains to just go with your strengths versus mitigating, and I'm one to try to go with my strengths in other domains, but as it pertains to character, we really have to work on those things where we fall short, where we know that we're weak, and have opportunities for growth. And we get other people to come in, speak into our leadership, our lives, and so forth, to help us to grow in that way.
So boots on the ground, like as we sort of have talked about character, virtues and character, integrity, obviously, spending time identifying their own weaknesses. But once they identify those, how does a person in today make themselves better than they were yesterday? Is it writing a virtue on a note card and just carrying it with you and looking for opportunities to sort of do that? Like, what are some practical ways? I mean, because all these things seem so like topics you read about in inspirational books, but boots on the ground, how do we get better? Like, how does a person listening to this podcast say, okay, this, I'm going to apply it to my life? How do we get better, move ourselves on the spectrum you talk about?
Sure. Well, I think, and not to be coy or flippant, it depends on the person. It depends on how you respond best to things. There are some who do well to write about things. I'm a writer by nature, and I contend that you don't know what you know or think until you write it. And so journaling may be something that people get a lot out of. I think that one thing that's important for most people is establishing somebody who can hold you accountable. Here's the standard that I'm shooting for. Can you hold me accountable when I fall short of that? Can you say, hey, I know you're trying to do well in this thing, but it seems to me like maybe you fell short on that. One thing that, so the oldest 4-star that I got to speak with was Admiral Jim Hogg, and Admiral Hogg's almost 90. He may be over 90, but he said that basically he had this practice where he said every day, at the end of the day, you have had the opportunity to be better or to be worse. Did I make myself better today? And so that was a practice that he used for a long, long time, longer than we've been alive. He's still doing that every day. So it's growing in that regard. General Pete Pace, who was the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, United States Marine, phenomenal person. He said every morning when he looks in the mirror, when he's shaving, he asks himself, where might I fall short today? And then, if you're prepared, I think it's recognition, first of all. That's the first step. It's my understanding of AA and the system of AA, having had relatives who've been in it. The first step is admitting there's a problem. Again, it's know thyself. It gets back to that know thyself idea. You have to be honest with yourself and say, when the pressure's on, I have a tendency to, whatever it is you do that you shouldn't do, that you don't want to do, knowing that, then when the pressure starts going up, you can start practicing against it. And so that things that people have done that tend to improve performance in this sort of scenario, to just sort of lay those out. Again, it's recognizing there's a problem, establishing a system by which you can be held accountable to that problem, and then introducing an exercise that will change it. And that exercise actually is an exercise, typically, most commonly, the most effective thing. So know thyself, recognize that there's a problem, ask somebody to help you with said problem, and then identify ways that you can practice in lower stress environments so that you can get better. It's this idea of exposure, to stressors, and how do you behave under that circumstance. So I think that's the process. For me, go ahead.
We've talked about these things before of like how do we sort of give ourselves a framework of how to deal with this. And we've talked about mission statements. They're great for companies, but also great for families. Like, what are the priorities that are going to sort of guard, and what are the rules, that we're going to have. I feel like there's a real opportunity to sort of, for everyone out there, to write a mission statement about their character at the top, and just list off some virtues that you either have a strength in or that you want to work on, and be like, patience. I will be a person of patience that demonstrates to others in all of my interactions that I'm a man of patience and hold this virtue. And we could even make a example of this and link it in the show notes so that people could sort of use that and modify it as theirs.
Yeah.
But I think of the idea of somebody having that pasted on their mirror in the morning, and like you said, out of sight, out of mind. If you're not looking at it, it's not in the front of your brain, you're going to ignore it. But having that every day of like, okay, what virtues or character traits or whatever am I going to sort of have today and work on, and at the end of the day looking at the same thing, was I better or worse? And then, like you said, having someone accountable to ask, and to be someone who will obviously be honest with you, that won't sugarcoat it. And the selection of that person is always tough.
Sure. Yeah. No, Justin, that's a great idea. It hits on a little bit of what Ben Franklin was known to do. And so Ben Franklin would identify something where he was going to improve, and he would spend 6 weeks working on that thing, right? And so, and this gets your idea of, okay, patience, let's say, and we're going to put a sticky note on the mirror, patience today. Do that. Don't try to fix the whole thing, right? Like character is a major thing, and it takes time to shift, right? And so going after 5-10 different virtues at one foul swoop is I mean, that's you need self-control, right? In that scenario. And so starting with one and working on that one and seeing fruit from it, and really getting to a place where you can say, okay, I've made progress here. Am I ready to move on to a different thing? I think that's really wise. That's been shown to be effective in all sorts of studies in people's lives. So I think that's a great idea, actually. Yeah, and we can make a template of some sort and put that in the notes, as you say.
So I think that's a great idea, giving us some practical way to move ourselves along the spectrum. I wanted to go back to something you had mentioned a little earlier, sort of really delving down into honesty and integrity. When you see a good leader with those characteristics, a good leader with good character, how does that look than a quote unquote good leader that does not have as strong of character? How do you see those differing?
You're creating some cognitive dissonance here, because you said good leader without character, and that I'm like, wires are crossing and there's smoke that's actually pumping into my headphones right now. because that doesn't work in my mind.
Does not compute.
Right, exactly. So no, when we look at studies that folks have done, and I mentioned the book earlier, Ordinary People, Extraordinary Leadership, or Everyday People, Extraordinary Leadership by Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner. In that book, they talk about, they've been studying leadership for a long, long time, and they talk about evaluating, surveying people from across the world. And the thing that is at the top of the list, and characteristics, if you will, of leaders that you're willing to follow, number one is honesty by a significant margin.
Wow.
Competence and other things fall down. But then if you keep going down the list, it's a set of all sorts of virtues pop up in their list. Again, self-discipline that I mentioned, consistency. There are a number of different virtues that are in there, and so people across the world really see that if we again distill those all into this idea of character, see that as really important to leadership, and the people that they want to follow are people of character. And so to this question of, I'll entertain the question, okay? I don't think, but no, this question of, can you be a good leader with bad character? Again, we go back to what I was talking about earlier with regard to, let's say you're a liar, you're dishonest. People are only going to follow you up until the point they recognize that, and then you'll have significant attrition. And only the people that are getting some gain from your lying will continue to follow you. And so I think so the answer there, I would say, is no, you're not going to, when you have attrition, you're not leading well, you're not going to accomplish your overall goals. And so there's going to be failure of leadership. Now, this gets into a much, much bigger concept. And that is, in the literature on leadership, there's this debate. In the general public, we don't typically think of it this way, but in the literature, people say, well, you can be an immoral leader, right? Because I think fundamentally that's what you're asking. Can you be immoral and still be, quote unquote, a good leader? And people always use all sorts of, Adolf Hitler comes to the top of the list every time, right? He's the quintessential example of someone we would say was immoral, but was able to get people to follow him and move toward seemingly a common goal, if we use that general definition that I tend to use. Influencing others to achieve a common goal is the definition of leadership. So he did that, right? But I think for most people who aren't writing papers and doing studies on this, there's an inherent moral component to the concept of leadership that when we think generally in society of leadership, we are, again, generally thinking about someone who is doing positive things to help things be better. And so, and again, scholars who are writing papers and doing studies and stuff, like I do, there's a camp of people that say, well, sure, you can be immoral and be a good leader. I'm a person who ascribes to this idea that there's an inherent moral component to leadership that's positive, this term of leadership. So
it touches on something that we mentioned in our previous episode, which is, what is the difference between a manager and a leader? You can have no character and be dishonest and be a manager of people and get things done.
Right, because it's whether or not the system works well. It's whether or not you achieve the outcome, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And that gets to this idea that I, I have a figure in chapter 1 of the book where it sort of lays out this concept. But if we just look at leaders and go back to this idea that it started with, I think, Peter Drucker. Managers do things right, leaders do the right thing. So a leader does the right thing. If we say that as just a fundamental concept, okay, you did the right thing. All right. Is that good leadership? No, not necessarily. And the right thing being you got the mission accomplished under whatever auspices you want to say. You got the mission accomplished. How about you did the right thing in the right way? Hey, that's pretty good leadership right there. Right? Like, it wasn't just that you accomplished the mission, you accomplished the mission in the right way. And by that meaning you didn't do something nefarious to accomplish it. You did it through upstanding means. That's pretty good leadership. But the zenith, if you will, of leadership is doing the right thing in the right way for the right reasons. So that it's much more than just accomplishing a mission. It's how you accomplish it and why you set out to accomplish it in the first place. We can look across
People would
history
say that in
and
sports
see.
all the time. People say that in sports all the times when people may have won, that may have won gold medals, they may have won a championship, and then it comes out that they did something that was against the rules.
Yeah.
It's interesting how it paints that. Yeah, they might have won, and they might not even get that title or whatever taken away. But it's interesting how the view of how they did it, and it goes back to, it's not only a matter of what you do and even what you accomplish, but how it gets done. And that really is attractive to people when they're like, you know what, they do that the right way, whatever that means. But it really seems to, when you boil it down as you have, really go back to that team, that leader, that woman is a person of character. And what does that mean? It usually is something to do with honesty and integrity. I mean, that seems to be almost like you were saying, the zenith of it all. It really matters not only what you do, but how you've done it. And I think that goes against a lot of production based.
It's that the peak is what you've done, how you've done, why you've done it. Right? You did it for the right reasons. I mean, there's so many things that people have done, but maybe they did the right thing and they did it in the right way, but it was all for self. We don't credit that as being some form of great character, right? Oftentimes that scenario is one where we would be repulsed almost, and maybe not almost, but we'd be repulsed by that idea that, yeah, this person did that thing, but it was all about themselves, all about their notoriety, their visibility, their fame and fortune, or whatever it may be. And that leaves a really bad taste in people's mouths.
That reminds me of something somebody told me at work the other day. And we were working with a group of people and they were talking about a particular leader. And they're like, yeah, I trust them because I know they're going to do what is right by the group. It was interesting that they had just made that statement. But in that, they're essentially saying, I know that person is not looking out for themselves. They're actually looking at the well-being of the team and of the group. Well, this has been awesome. An awesome talk about character, what it is, how we can get better. Where do people go to sort of learn more about this and sort of delve even deeper into the 4 C's and character in and of itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's so many resources that are available. There are plenty of books, whether it's self-help books or leadership books or ancient, religious texts, talk about character quite a bit. So I think there are plenty of resources out there. I could name hundreds, but I think that one thing that hopefully will be forthcoming before too long will be my book, and it talks about character at length and different components and how that manifests in leadership specifically. So, but for now, I would say those things that have stood the test of time the longest are probably the ancient religious texts. Whether or not somebody has faith in a greater being, the wisdom in those texts with regard to character is hard to assail. Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.